a real honor to be joined by those involved with Murder in Bighorn, a docu-series about something just so critically important, the murders and disappearances of Native American women, Indigenous women in Montana over many decades, and especially recently as well. How did this project come about? How did this first come together as like, we're going to tell this as one big story about this horrible thing that's happening in America?
Showtime approached me. I have a sort of a years-long relationship with them with this very general idea that they were interested in this issue that they didn't know a lot about, but clearly something's going on in Native American communities. And just at that was, maybe mid-2020, there were a couple of articles that had landed on the front page of the New York Times about, the first one I think was about Selena Not Afraid's case. It was early 2020, and that was I think was Showtime's sort of first exposure to the issue, and so they brought it to me. As a white man, I did not feel comfortable going in it alone as a director. Like I felt like we needed Native representation on the team, and I called Razelle. The first call I had made was to Bird Running Water, who used to run the Sundance Indigenous program, and he connected me also with Sterling Harjo, who went on to create Reservoir Dogs. Together, they both said, you got to call Razelle Benally. She's your perfect collaborator. And so Razelle and I joined forces. And, from the beginning, we felt it was crucial to tell a human story. So we wanted to address this enormous issue that had been going on for centuries, but do it through the telling of specific families' stories.
That's what I think is so unique, is that you obviously have these specific stories that have affected people's lives in just the past few years and the families that are involved, but also you really bring in the broader historical context as well, what it meant, when the reservations were created, and that the sort of psychological effect that had on the community writ large, and how that's still being felt today. How did you balance those two things?
Well, first of all, we really did not want to make a true crime genre doc. And because we were making a doc series, we had a little bit of time to go in depth and tell this this narrative, which fully is at the root because of colonization. And so when we touched base with Luella Brien here, and when Lucy Simpson came on board, we felt like it gave us ample time to really talk through and really illuminate the roots of what's going on with Indigenous women being targeted, violence against Native women, why it's such an issue.
The result was talking about it us not wanting to make just a straight up true crime series. This is a much bigger issue than that. We're all for people. We want as many people as possible to watch the series. There are certainly true crime tropes more at the beginning of the series than the end, to a lot to engage viewers. But ultimately, with these cases, they're no spoiler here. A lot of them aren't solved because there was terrible law enforcement investigations. But really, the underpinnings of all of it, the big crime with a capital C, is colonization. The answer, there is no mystery here. So the idea that the media sort of portrays the idea that this is just a sort of it's a true mystery of what happens to these women and these girls. The answer is plain as day if you look at the history, and it goes back hundreds of years. And that's why we made the decision to make it the underpinnings of all of these cases. History is so important.
Luella, Lucy, what was the process of you getting involved with Matthew and Razelle and making of this? Like, how did that come together?
Initially, my involvement was coming in as background and just, letting the team know who's good in the community to talk to, giving them free reign of the archives at the newspaper I had worked at. And then they just wanted to ask me a couple questions, and then pretty soon that turned into two-hour interview sessions, and then pretty soon
They were longer than 2 hours.
Oh,
They were
I had a lot of
days.
breakthroughs. And then pretty soon they wanted me to narrate some stuff, and pretty soon they were following me around. So it slowly
That's how it
evolved. It slowly evolved into me being as involved as I was. And I think that if it wasn't such a slow and natural evolution, I don't think I would have been involved as much.
Again, I was also, I think, just brought in mostly for background and talking not so much specifically about the issues there in Bighorn County, but for Native people within the United States and the history of colonization, the history of boarding schools, the history of the trauma that's been inflicted upon our people by the federal government, and how that impacts the everyday lives of Native peoples today. I don't think there's one Native person in the United States who would be able to say that their life in every way is not impacted by federal laws. Every day, our lives have the ceremonies that we practice, our ability to speak our languages, where we have our homelands, where we have our reservations. That's all governed by the federal government, and that's the history of that is where we get to the point that we're at now, where we have women and children going missing, girls going missing on a regular basis within our communities.
And I mean, we see the hurdles that you all were up against. I mean, in terms of the indifference or outright hostility of law enforcement regarding these cases. What was like the biggest hurdle that you had in terms of making this film, for any of you, like in terms of getting the story out there?
Well, I think that because these communities are so small, the reality is that people know things, but then there's a saying in a lot of our different communities of we're all related. Well, it kind of feels like that a lot of times where you don't want to say anything. There's going to be repercussions. And I think there's just like a lot of fear.
Yeah. The fear that people have in the community that they might get somebody else in trouble for something. But for me, as a journalist, as a working journalist in the community, the biggest hurdle was access to information. Bighorn County was not willing to give us any kind of information in any of the cases. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Justice Services, police, which would be the police force on the reservations, they were not willing to give us any information. FBI can't get anything from them, and if you could get anything from them, it's 80% redacted. So access to good information about these cases is just non-existent.
I think another hurdle there is also building trust within the community so that the families felt like they could tell their stories honestly. And that's, I think, credit to Razelle and Matthew and the team that they brought in, of their ability to build those relationships with those families for them to be able to feel like they could tell their stories, which is ultimately, these stories belong to those families. It's their loved ones. It's not anyone else's place to tell that.
What needs to be done next? When the last episode of Murder in Bighorn airs, like, what do you want to have happen then? What needs to happen then?
Ultimately, to be able to get a better response, to be able to get justice, we need to have a change in federal policies. We need to have additional resources within our communities. But in addition to that, we have to be able to address the hard truths of the history in this United States, and people being willing to have those conversations, recognize that there is ongoing racial discrimination happening. And at the bottom line is trying to address the invisibility of Native people within this country, which is, I think, rampant for the most part. Unless you're watching, docuseries that highlights Native people, we're not at anyone's thought process in any given day. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the first things that has to happen, is people have to recognize that we're still here. We have over 560 federally recognized tribes within the United States. We have thriving cultures, and we also have a lot of trauma.
There's a perfect storm of social and political and federal issues that bring cases like these into fruition. We have meth epidemic, we have opioid epidemic, we have social justice issues going on. All of these things culminate and create situations in which it's ripe for human trafficking. It's ripe for overdoses. It's ripe for murders that aren't going to get solved, for kidnapping that isn't going to get solved. And until we start addressing those issues on a home base, on a state base, on a federal base, then it's going to continue. And I'm still going to be writing articles about, the 16-year-old girl that went missing, the 14-year-old girl that went missing, the 13-year-old boy that went missing, the 48-year-old man or woman that went missing. Until we start addressing the issues that are plaguing our communities, it's going to continue happening.
And what it comes down to is that we're a group of people truly, directly still dealing with the effects of colonization. And if there's anything that Murder in Bighorn does is help educate and illuminate, why this matters.
And connecting with non-Native audiences is incredibly important to us. Obviously, people within the Native communities have known that these issues exist forever. But, I'm non-Native, and I didn't know anything about this issue. And so it was one of the most important things once I got engaged in this project is to figure out how Razelle and I could make this in a way that would engage with non-Native audiences.